One day, a little girl decided to ask her mother, how did the human race begin? The mom said, well, dear, it's like this. God created Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had children, and that's how it all started. The next day, the little girl decided to ask her dad the same question. Dad, how did it all begin? The dad said, well, dear, it's like this. Many, many, many years ago, there were monkeys. The monkeys evolved into apes, and the apes evolved into people. And that's how it all began. The next day, the little girl went back to her mom and said, Mom, I don't understand. When I asked you how it all began, you said God created Adam and Eve, they had children, and that's how it began. Dad said that we all evolved from monkeys. What's going on? The mom said, well, dear, it's like this. I told you about my side of the family. And your dad told you about his side of the family. The title of my lesson today is From Sacrifice to Joyous Giving. Emily Cady, who wrote our classic unity book, Lessons in Truth, once said, unless you use the truth that you know in service to other people, your path to enlightenment, to Christ consciousness will be a long, slow slog indeed. As a child, I was allergic to service. I was allergic to giving. My hero when I was a kid was Maynard G. Krebs. Some of you might remember him from Gilligan's Island. Every time he heard the word work, he got this terrified look in his face and he'd say, work! That was my hero. My belief was that service is a form of work, and work was something to avoid. I thought, the more I can avoid work, the more I can avoid service, the more I can avoid giving, the happier I'll be in life. I heard people talk about what they called a soft, cushy job as the ideal to look for. And I heard in church, give until it hurts. Did you ever hear that? The idea was that giving money, giving time, giving service hurts. Giving a small amount doesn't hurt so much. So keep giving until you really feel the pain. Doesn't that sound like something you want more of in your life? Of course not. In fact, one way to describe the history of religion, period, is that of slowly letting go of a belief in sacrifice. Long ago, way long ago, human sacrifice was practiced in all religions and all cultures. This was the culture in which the patriarch Abraham lived. Late in life, he and Sarah had a son named Isaac. And metaphysically, the name Isaac means joy. Then, 12 years later, Abraham thought that he heard God say, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. Or in other words, I want you to kill your son. How do you suppose Abraham heard what he believed that God was telling him? Well, the same way you and I do, of course, through his own thoughts. So, did God really ask Abraham to kill his son? Of course not. Would Spirit ever ask you to kill your child? Of course not. Would Spirit ever ask you to sacrifice your joy? Absolutely not. But in Abraham's day, this was how people showed their love for God. They sacrificed the most precious thing they had. A Course in Miracles tells us that sacrifice is entirely something that we project onto God. Goes like this. We believed that we separated from God. This felt like a huge, even total sacrifice. So we think God or Spirit wants us to sacrifice. And it's not true at all. In the story of Abraham, he looks up, which means he raises his consciousness to a new level. He sees a scapegoat in the brambles, stuck in the branches. And an idea occurs. I don't have to sacrifice my son. This goat will work just fine. This actually was a great leap forward in the history of mankind. In the rest of the Old Testament, people, of course, sacrifice animals and birds, not people. But then when Jesus comes along, when he enters the scene, the only way they know how to see his life and his death was as one big sacrifice. One of my favorite theologians is a retired Episcopal bishop named John Shelby Spong. And I want to read something that Bishop Spong wrote in one of his books. He says, "Have you ever heard someone say, 'Jesus died for my sins'?" He says, "Does it make any sense at all to say that someone had to die for my sins? Why cannot God simply forgive? What kind of God is it who requires a human sacrifice before this God is willing to offer forgiveness?" And then I added here in parentheses, along with the idea that, of course, Jesus tells us human beings to forgive how many times? 70 times 7. In other words, nonstop. Bishop Spong continues, "Would any of us ever be drawn in worship to such a deity? If it took the cruel death of Jesus on the cross before our sins could be forgiven, would any of us ever escape the guilt of realizing that our sinfulness was responsible for Jesus' death?" Let's all take a deep breath here, all right? "Why," he said, "would anyone ever call such an understanding of God good news?" This bizarre but often repeated cliche, he says, represents a total misunderstanding of the Christian message. Jesus never taught any of this. In fact, the only place in the Gospels where Jesus says why he's here is in the Gospel of John, where he says, "I have come that you might have life, and that you might have it abundantly." And in A Course in Miracles, Jesus says, for those of us who think he wrote the Course in Miracles, which I do, he says, "My death was no sacrifice." Why? I'm not dead. A big part of how to live an abundant life is to live a life of giving, a life of service. And to do this, it's crucial to release the belief that sacrifice is love. If we believe God wants us to sacrifice, that is to lose through giving, we will be afraid of God and afraid of love. I'd like to share with you something a friend of mine, a colleague, fellow Unity minister named Joan Gattuso, wrote in a book 20 years ago Her book was called A Course in Love. And here's what she says. Whatever the perceived good might be, the idea of sacrifice says that there's not enough good for everyone to have some. It is a notion that we live in a world of scarcity, that we must give up what little we have in order for another to have anything at all. Sacrifice, she says, is a family of 5 sitting down to dinner with 4 servings on the table. The mother says, "Oh, it doesn't matter. I'm not hungry. You can have mine." Meanwhile, she's exhausted and starving. We have all denied ourselves our rightful serving and said it doesn't matter when it did. It mattered a lot. Just because the idea of sacrifice is everywhere does not mean that it is true. Each time we believe sacrifice is called for, we are denying who we are and all that God is. A Course in Miracles, she says, teaches that our confusion of sacrifice with love is so profound that we cannot conceive of love without sacrifice. It is this notion we must look at. We must come to understand that sacrifice is actually attack and not love. The teaching continues. If you would accept this one idea, your fear of love would vanish. Imagine that. You accept this one idea, your fear of love will vanish. In the game of sacrifice, she concludes, there are always seeming winners and losers. In the game of love, everyone gets to be a winner. So I have 3 truths to share with you this morning. The first truth is God or Spirit never asks us to sacrifice. That is, to do something solely for the benefit of other people. The second truth is a good working definition of hell is having no way to contribute. And the third is when we're living from our real self, our divinity, not our fearful ego mind, we all love to contribute. We all love to give. It's our natural state. Wayne Dyer, who I love, one of my role models, said, whatever success I've had in life, there's one basic, simple reason for it, and that is my statement, I'm here to serve. In another place, he said, we don't attract what we want in life. We attract what we are, which is so true. 40 years ago, I learned that living a life of giving and service is where all the fun is. And it aligns us with the basic law of life, which is circulation. Jesus said it like this, give, and it will be given unto you. Good measure, shaken together, pressed down and running over, will people pour into your lap. Late one afternoon, a carpenter in a small town, the carpenter's name was Brian Anderson. He was on his way home from work after a tiring day, and as he drove along a lonely stretch of highway on his way home, on the other side, on the shoulder coming the other direction, was a Mercedes-Benz with its flashers on. And as Brian drove by, he could see that there was an older woman in the car. So he thought to himself, what if I was that woman? Or even more, what if my wife was that woman? Would I want someone to stop? So he turned around, pulled up behind the woman, behind her car, got out, walked up to her driver's side window, and he could see that she lowered the window a crack. And he could see in looking in her eyes that she was really afraid. Like, who is this and what does he want? So he thought maybe it would be helpful if he said who he was. So he said, hi, I'm Brian Anderson, and I'm a local carpenter. I live just down the road, and I'm here to fix your change your tire. So all you have to do, ma'am, is sit in the car and where it's warm, and if you just open the trunk, which of course she could do from inside, I will just get the jack out, get the tire out, fix the tire, and you can be on your way. So he did. When he was finished, tools put back in the trunk and the other tire, he walked back up to her window. She lowered it just a little bit more and said, "Sir, I am so grateful. How much do I owe you for this?" He said, "Not a thing, ma'am. But if you see someone down the road a piece and you want to pass this on, go right ahead." She took off in her car, and a little while later, she came to a stop, or she decided to stop, rather, at a little gas station cafe. It was late in the day now, maybe 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and there was a waitress there, and she was the only customer. The waitress was 8 months pregnant, but came over to her with a smile on her face and gave her great service. And when it was time to pay, the woman gave the waitress a $100 bill. The waitress brought the change back, but by the time she got to the table, the woman was gone. And on the paper placemat, she had written a note. She said, "Someone did me a favor today, and I would like to pass it on. I see that you're about to have a child. I hope this helps with any expenses that you may incur." And as she lifted the mat, there were 4 more $100 bills under the mat. The woman closed up. It was her job to close the restaurant, the cafe. And when she went home, her husband was already in bed because it was getting late by this time. And he was asleep. She got in bed, snuggled up beside him, and just said in a whisper, "Husband of mine, it's going to be okay." Because she knew her husband had been worried about money with the child coming. And then she said, "I love you, Brian Anderson." Everything we give is given to ourselves. So how do we shift from a life of sacrifice to a life of joyous giving? We do that by always including ourselves as one of the receivers of what we are giving. And that includes our financial giving, as well as the giving of our time and our talent. Here at Unity, we teach tithing, giving the first tenth to God of our time, our talent, and our treasure as a basic personal prosperity principle. Financially, I do this by taking that amount inside and literally giving it to my one unlimited source. And then I give to whoever or whatever Spirit directs. Through financial tithing, I've seen many seeming miracles happen in my life. Some of you know exactly what I mean. I'll share a couple. One day, as my wife and I were getting ready to turn 66 and deciding we were going to apply for Social Security, just the month before, a friend of mine from high school that I hadn't talked to in 30 years called me out of the clear blue sky. His reason for calling was to ask me if I wanted to attend a wedding in one of his granddaughters. But I was in Florida and he was in Minnesota. That wasn't going to work. But in the process, he said, "Have you ever heard of the concept of file and suspend regarding Social Security?" Well, you can't do that anymore. But fortunately for me, you could then. And that meant when we turned 66, when both my wife and I turned 66, we could one of us could file at that point for Social Security, but suspend the benefits. If we did that, and this was to be the person who would receive the most Social Security money, we would still get half of the money every month until we actually filed. And still, our benefits would keep increasing at the same rate as if we hadn't done that. Out of the blue, this call came. I would have no way of knowing that And in the process of that, we received $40,000 extra that we would never have received otherwise. A couple of years later, a friend of ours received an inheritance, a former student, and decided to tithe to my wife and I $20,000. I'd like to share with you a little bit of Edwin Gaines' story. Many of you know that Edwin Gaines is our ambassador of prosperity, our prosperity teacher to all Unity churches and hopefully way beyond that. Here's what she says. She says, when I first began to tithe, I chose to believe, or at least to act as if I believed the promise that tithing on my income would prosper me. And I made a commitment to tithe for 6 months. The first 3 months, nothing much happened in my outer world. We did eat. The electric company did not turn off my electricity. And I did a lot of affirmations and denials, such as, creditors can't eat me. Creditors can't eat me. In the inner world, however, my faith began to grow, and I was guided to open my first business with a $2.75 classified ad. My phone rang off the hook, and I began to prosper after 3 months so much that I found that my income was doubled. At the end of 6 months, my income had tripled, and I was off and running with an excitement and passion for truth and for life. I am so glad that Reverend Kathy is leading the 4T series here at Unity. Before I got here, you asked me to address the concept of financial lack in the congregation. And I will tell you all, as I tell every congregation I work with, that the one thing that always assures a prosperous ministry, a thriving ministry, is a ministry where people practice prosperity principles in their personal life, and that includes tithing. So I asked Kathy if she would be willing to teach that series here. If you haven't yet signed up, I encourage you to do so. There's still time, and it is a wonderful way to learn and practice how to have more abundance in your personal life. Living a life of joyous giving is how we maintain our experience of oneness with Spirit. Losing that connection, that would be the real sacrifice. So let this be your time to release the concept that giving means loss and practice joyous giving of your time, your talent, and your treasure. This is how to fully live the abundant life that Jesus came here to teach us. Namaste.